"Step back, ma'am," the officer said, his voice flat, already tired of her before she'd even spoken. And then the burst came. Cold water cutting through the late afternoon heat, splashing across Naomi Carter's face and soaking into the thin fabric of her gray t-shirt like she wasn't even there, like she was just something to be moved, rinsed, erased, and for a second, everything around them seemed to pause as if the street itself had taken a breath it didn't know how to release. The sound of traffic dulled. The chatter from the sidewalk cafe across the street dropped into a low murmur, and all that remained was the quiet drip of water falling from Naomi's hair down to the concrete in steady, measured taps, each drop catching the sunlight before it disappeared into the dark stains spreading at her feet. She didn't raise her hands, didn't step back, didn't wipe her face. Just stood there with her shoulders relaxed and her chin slightly lifted, her eyes open despite the sting, focused. Somewhere past the officer, like she was trying to see something deeper than what was happening right in front of her. A few feet away, someone lifted a phone, then another, small black rectangles rising one by one like silent witnesses, capturing a moment no one would step into. Officer Ryan Whitaker adjusted his grip on the hose nozzle, his uniform crisp despite the humidity, the badge on his chest catching a sharp glint of light, his jaw tight in the way of someone who had already decided what the truth was and had no interest in revisiting it. "I told you to move along," he added, louder now, as if volume could fill the space where certainty should have been, and a couple standing near the curb shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance but saying nothing, their silence blending seamlessly into the rest of the street's indifference. Naomi's breathing was steady, visible only in the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the water tracing slow paths along her cheekbones, dripping from her jawline, soaking the collar of her shirt until it clung to her skin. She blinked once, then again, not in panic, not in anger, but in something quieter, something harder to name, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft enough that the people closest had to lean in just a fraction to hear it. "I didn't do anything wrong." The words landing without force, without accusation, just a statement placed carefully into the air between them. Whitaker let out a short breath through his nose, the kind that wasn't quite a laugh, but carried the same dismissive edge, and he shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the pavement, leaving faint arcs in the dust. "That's not what it looks like," he replied, his gaze flicking briefly to the small crowd that had formed, as if checking that they were still watching, still seeing what he wanted them to see. Somewhere behind Naomi, a car horn sounded, sharp and impatient, then faded, swallowed by the stillness that had settled over this small patch of the city. A little boy stood near the edge of the sidewalk, clutching a paper bag, his eyes wide, his fingers tightening around the crumpled top as he watched the water drip from Naomi's hair, his mother's hand resting on his shoulder but not pulling him away. Naomi's gaze shifted for just a moment, catching the boy's eyes, and something in her expression softened. Not fear, not shame, but recognition, like she understood what it meant to be seen without being understood. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement, turning the scene into something almost staged, almost unreal. The golden light catching on the droplets still falling from her sleeves. Whitaker lowered the nozzle slightly, not turning it off, just enough that the pressure eased, the stream thinning into a steady trickle, and he tilted his head, studying her now with a trace of impatience creeping in, like he couldn't quite figure out why she wasn't reacting the way he expected. Naomi didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't offer him the resistance or the fear that would have made this easier to justify. And in that quiet refusal, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but present enough to ripple through the air. The phone stayed raised, the murmurs stayed low, and the city kept its distance, watching a moment unfold that no one had planned but everyone would remember. Differently, Naomi drew in a slow breath, the kind that filled her lungs all the way down, grounding her in a body that felt suddenly too exposed, and yet entirely her own. And as the last of the water dripped from her fingertips to the ground, she lifted her eyes fully to meet Whitaker's for the first time, not challenging, not pleading, just looking. And in that look there was a quiet question, one that didn't need to be spoken to be felt, a question about what he saw when he looked at her and whether, even for a second, he saw a person at all. The water stopped completely, but the dampness stayed, clinging to Naomi Carter's skin like a second layer she could not peel away, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the spray itself, stretching across the sidewalk in a way that made every small movement seem louder than it should have been. A car rolled slowly past the intersection, its tires humming against the asphalt. The driver glancing over for half a second before looking away, as if choosing distance over involvement, and somewhere behind the small cluster of onlookers, a metal chair scraped against concrete outside the cafe, the sound sharp enough to cut through the stillness before fading just as quickly. Officer Ryan Whitaker shifted his stance again, his hand now resting at his belt, fingers tapping once, then still, his posture straight, but no longer as certain as it had been moments ago. Like the script he had been following was missing a line he expected Naomi to deliver. She remained where she was, water, continuing to trace quiet paths down her arms, her fingers slightly curled at her sides, not clenched, not tense, just present. And when a drop slid from her wrist and hit the ground, it sounded louder than it should have. A small, steady reminder that the moment had not moved on yet. The boy with the paper bag took a step forward before his mother gently pulled him back, her grip careful, not harsh. Her eyes flicking between Naomi and the officer as if measuring something she could not quite define. Naomi noticed the movement, her gaze softening again for a fraction of a second, and without thinking, she shifted her weight just enough to block the lingering trickle of water from reaching the edge of the sidewalk where it might have splashed toward the child's shoes. A small adjustment, almost invisible, but deliberate. Whitaker followed her movement, his brow tightening slightly, confusion threading through his expression in a way he did not seem comfortable with, because it did not match the version of events he had already settled into. "You need to clear the area," he said again, though his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, the words sounding more like an obligation than a command, and he glanced briefly at the growing number of phones still raised, their lenses reflecting small fragments of light back at him. Naomi tilted her head just a fraction, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a steadiness that did not need volume to be heard. "Where would you like me to go?" she asked, each word placed carefully, not rushed, not pushed, just offered, and the question lingered in the space between them, simple on the surface, but carrying something deeper beneath it. Whitaker opened his mouth as if to respond immediately, then paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he searched for an answer that felt solid, something that would re-establish the control he was used to holding without question. But the street did not move with him, the crowd did not shift to support him, and for a brief moment, the balance of the scene felt uncertain. A breeze moved through the block, light but enough to lift a few strands of Naomi's damp hair, brushing them across her cheek before they settled again, and the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows that stretched past their feet and merged together on the pavement. Naomi drew in another slow breath, the air cooler now against her skin, and she straightened just slightly, not taller, not larger, but more grounded, as if she had decided something quietly within herself that no one else could. Here, Whitaker exhaled, a longer breath this time, and lowered his gaze briefly before bringing it back up, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to read something he had missed, but whatever he was looking for did not present itself in a way he could easily categorize. Behind them, a door opened, the soft chime of a bell marking the movement as someone stepped out from the cafe, their footsteps measured, unhurried, approaching the edge of the scene without drawing attention at first. Just another presence entering the frame of a moment that had already stretched longer than anyone expected. Naomi did not turn toward the sound immediately, her focus still on Whitaker, still holding that quiet line between them. But something in the air shifted again, subtle, like the temperature had changed by a degree no one could see, but everyone could feel. Whitaker's shoulders tightened slightly, his posture adjusting in response to something beyond Naomi now, though he had not yet fully turned to face it, and for a brief second, the certainty that had anchored him earlier seemed to loosen, just enough to let something unfamiliar in. Naomi blinked once more, steady, composed, and the water that had once defined the moment now felt secondary, fading into the background as the silence deepened, waiting, holding, as if the street itself knew that whatever came next would not belong to the officer alone. The sound of those approaching footsteps settled into the space behind Naomi Carter with a calm that felt out of place against the tension still hanging in the air, steady and unhurried. Each step measured like it belonged to someone who did not need to rush to be heard. And as the figure came to a stop just at the edge of the small crowd, a subtle shift moved through the onlookers, shoulders straightening, phones tilting slightly, as if something about this presence quietly demanded attention. Without asking for it, Naomi felt it before she saw it. The change in the air, the way the silence tightened not with fear, but with anticipation, and she turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse of the man, now standing a few feet behind Officer Ryan Whitaker, dressed simply in a dark jacket and light shirt, nothing about him loud or commanding at first glance. Yet there was a stillness to him that contrasted sharply with the restless energy of the scene. Whitaker sensed it too, his posture stiffening as he turned halfway, his eyes landing on the man with a brief flicker of recognition that he could not immediately place. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filling with an unspoken question that stretched just long enough to be noticed. The man's gaze moved from Whitaker to Naomi, not scanning, not assessing, but observing with a quiet focus that felt different from the eyes that had been watching her before. And when his eyes met hers, there was no hesitation in them, no doubt, just a clear, steady acknowledgement that landed deeper than any words could have. Naomi held that gaze for a fraction of a second longer than she had intended, something inside her shifting slightly, like a weight adjusting rather than lifting. And then she looked forward again, her shoulders still relaxed, her stance unchanged. Whitaker cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound that broke the silence just enough to reassert his place in the moment. And he straightened, turning fully now to face the man, his voice returning but lacking the sharp edge it carried before. "Sir, you need to step back," he said, though the words came out more measured than forceful, as if he was testing how much authority they still held. The man did not move, did not raise his voice, did not interrupt. He simply stood there with his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture balanced and calm. And after a brief pause, he spoke, his voice low but clear, enough to carry through the stillness without effort. "I have been standing here the entire time," he said, each word even, deliberate, not confrontational but impossible to dismiss. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances, their attention now shifting more fully toward him, curiosity threading through their silence, and one of the phones angled slightly to capture both men in the same frame. Whitaker's jaw tightened just a fraction, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place the tone. The presence, something about the man that did not align with the usual reactions he encountered, and he shifted his weight again, his hand brushing lightly against his belt before falling back to his side. Naomi remained still, but her awareness sharpened, her senses catching the subtle shifts in posture, in tone, in the space itself. And for the first time since the water had hit her skin, the focus of the moment was no longer centered entirely on her. The man took a single step forward, not invading, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance slightly, and as he did, the late sunlight caught the edge of a small metallic clip at his jacket pocket, glinting briefly before settling back into shadow, a detail so quick it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way Whitaker's eyes flicked to it and paused for a fraction of a second too long. Naomi's gaze followed instinctively, her breath steady, her posture unchanged, and though she did not fully understand what was shifting, she felt it clearly now, the balance of the moment tilting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, away from where it had begun. Whitaker exhaled again, this time slower, his shoulders rising and falling with the motion, and he glanced briefly at the crowd, then back at the man, recalibrating, searching for footing that no longer felt as firm as it had minutes before. The boy with the paper bag leaned slightly to the side, trying to see past his mother's arm, his eyes fixed now on the new figure, curiosity overtaking the uncertainty that had held him earlier. Naomi blinked once, the last traces of water on her lashes catching the light as they fell away, and in that quiet, suspended moment, she felt something she had not felt since the first command had been spoken. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of something that moved in that direction, subtle and cautious, like the first shift in wind before a change in weather. The man's gaze returned briefly to her, steady, grounded, and though he had not raised his voice, had not made a demand, had not revealed anything beyond his presence, the silence that followed him now carried weight, the kind that suggested the moment was no longer solely in the hands of the officer, and the street, still and watching, seemed to recognize it all at once. The light shifted again, softer now as the sun dipped lower behind the row of buildings, stretching the shadows across the sidewalk until they overlapped and blurred into one another. And in that quiet merge of shapes, the space between Naomi Carter, Officer Ryan Whitaker, and the man behind him felt smaller, tighter, as if the moment itself was drawing them closer without any of them taking a step. The man's gaze did not waver, steady and composed, and he reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just a deliberate motion that drew Whitaker's attention. Immediately, the officer's shoulders tensing as his eyes followed the movement, instinct pulling him alert even as uncertainty lingered beneath it. Naomi noticed the shift in Whitaker first, the subtle tightening around his eyes, the way his stance adjusted just a fraction, and then she saw the man's hand emerge holding a small leather wallet, worn but clean, which he opened with a quiet snap that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness. Inside, a badge caught the fading sunlight, its metallic surface reflecting a brief, sharp glint that flashed across Whitaker's face before settling into something more subdued, and for a second, the officer did not react at all, his expression caught between recognition and resistance. The man did not raise the badge high, did not present it with force. He simply held it at chest level, angled just enough for Whitaker to see clearly. And then he spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard without needing to raise his tone. "Marcus Ellington," he said, not as an introduction seeking approval, but as a statement of fact. Whitaker's breath caught just slightly, a small pause that might have gone unnoticed if the street had not been so quiet, and his eyes flicked from the badge to the man's face, searching, confirming, the name settling into place with a realization that changed the air around him. Naomi watched the shift unfold, not fully understanding the title, not yet, but recognizing the change in posture, the way Whitaker's certainty seemed to loosen further, replaced now by something more measured, more careful. The crowd felt it too, a ripple moving through the small group as a few phones adjusted, zooming in, capturing the badge, the face, the moment of recognition that no one spoke aloud. Whitaker straightened, his shoulders pulling back as if to reassemble the authority he had held earlier, but the movement lacked its previous ease, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different texture now, controlled but no longer dismissive. "Sir," he began, then stopped, the word hanging there as he recalibrated. "I was handling a situation," he continued, choosing each word with care, as if aware now that they would carry weight beyond the street. Judge Marcus Ellington lowered the badge slightly, but did not close it, his gaze steady on Whitaker, and he took a small step closer, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance further, his presence now fully within the center of the moment. "I observed the situation," Marcus replied, his tone unchanged, not accusatory, not raised, just clear, and he let the words settle before adding, "From the beginning," each syllable landing with quiet precision. Naomi felt something in her chest ease, not fully, not completely, but enough to allow her shoulders to drop just a fraction, the tension that had been holding her in place beginning to release in slow, careful increments. Whitaker's jaw tightened again, but this time it was different, not the sharp edge of control, but the restrained pressure of someone aware that the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as it had seemed. He glanced briefly at Naomi, then back to Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for a path forward that would not unravel the moment entirely. The breeze moved through again, lifting the edge of Naomi's damp sleeve, cooling the skin beneath it, and she let out a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding, her gaze shifting now between the two men, taking in the subtle changes, the recalibration of power happening without raised voices or sudden movements. Marcus closed the badge with a soft click, the sound precise, final in its own quiet way, and slipped it back into his jacket pocket, his hands returning to his sides as he held Whitaker's gaze. There are procedures, he said, his voice still even, but carrying a firmness that did not need volume to be understood. And there are people, he added after a brief pause. The words simple, but layered with meaning that hung in the air between them. Naomi blinked slowly, the last traces of water now gone from her lashes, her face still damp, but no longer the center of the scene. And for the first time since the moment began, she felt something shift in how she was being seen. Not as a problem to be managed, not as an interruption, but as a person standing in the middle of a moment that was finally beginning to change. Whitaker exhaled, longer this time, his shoulders rising and falling as he processed what stood in front of him, the weight of the situation settling into place. And though he did not step back, did not lower his stance completely, the certainty that had defined him earlier was no longer there, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. As the street remained still, watching the moment unfold with a different kind of silence now, one that carried expectation rather than indifference. Whitaker's fingers hovered for a moment near his belt before falling away completely, the small motion almost unnoticeable, but enough to signal that something inside him had shifted from reaction to calculation, and he drew in a slow breath through his nose, holding it just long enough to steady himself before letting it out again, his gaze moving briefly to the ground where the darkened patch of pavement still marked where the water had pooled, then back up to Naomi Carter, as if seeing her now required a different kind of focus than before. The crowd remained quiet, but the silence had changed, no longer passive, no longer detached. Now it felt attentive, expectant, like a held note waiting to resolve, and a few of the raised phones lowered slightly, not because the moment had ended, but because it had deepened into something harder to capture through a screen. Naomi stood where she had been all along, but her posture had softened in a way that was almost imperceptible, her shoulders no longer carrying the same rigid weight, her hands resting more naturally at her sides, the damp fabric of her shirt beginning to dry in uneven patches under the warm air, and she glanced once at the boy near the curb, offering him a faint, reassuring look that seemed to settle him more than any words could have. Marcus Ellington shifted his stance just enough to square himself between Naomi and Whitaker, not blocking, not confronting, simply present in a way that made the space feel more balanced, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried that same calm authority that did not press, but did not yield either. "Officer, I would like you to walk me through what led you here," he said, the request simple on the surface but structured in a way that required clarity, accountability, and time. Whitaker nodded once, a short, controlled motion, and he straightened slightly, as if stepping into a version of himself that was more familiar, more practiced. "I received a report of a disturbance," he began, his tone measured, careful, each word placed with intention now. "When I arrived, she was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, refusing to move along." He continued, his eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi before returning to Marcus. And there was a pause there, a small gap where certainty had once lived but now felt thinner, less solid. Naomi did not interrupt, did not correct. She simply listened, her breathing even, her gaze steady. And in that quiet restraint there was a strength that did not demand recognition but held its ground nonetheless. Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the explanation without affirming it, his expression thoughtful rather than reactive, and he tilted his head just a fraction, as if examining the details from another angle. "And at what point did you determine that water was necessary?" he asked, his tone unchanged, but the question landing with precision that cut through the narrative Whitaker had begun to construct. Whitaker's lips pressed together briefly before he responded, the answer coming a second slower than the last. "She was not complying," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, they seemed to lose some of their weight in the open air, as if the simplicity of the explanation did not fully support the action it was meant to justify. A faint murmur moved through the crowd, not loud, not disruptive, just enough to ripple through the silence, and the boy's mother shifted her stance, her hand tightening slightly on her son's shoulder before relaxing again. Naomi blinked once, her gaze dropping momentarily to the damp hem of her shirt, then lifting again, and she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I asked where I should go," she said, not defensive, not accusatory, simply adding a piece to the picture that had not been included. and the words settled into the space with a different kind of weight, one that did not push but lingered. Whitaker's eyes moved to her again, this time holding for a fraction longer, and there was something there now that had not been present before, not quite understanding, not quite agreement, but a recognition that the moment was no longer unfolding solely on his terms. Marcus watched the exchange without interruption, his gaze moving between them with a calm attentiveness, and after a brief pause, he spoke again. "Intent matters," he said, the words quiet but firm. "And so does perception," he added, letting the statement stand on its own without immediate explanation. The breeze moved through once more, carrying with it the faint scent of coffee and warm pavement, and the light shifted again, casting Naomi's shadow slightly behind her now, longer, more defined, stretching toward the edge of the street. Whitaker exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, and he nodded. Again, this time less rigid, more reflective, as if acknowledging not just the presence of Marcus, but the weight of the moment itself. Naomi remained still, but something inside her had shifted more fully now, the tension that had once held her in place giving way to a quiet steadiness. And as she looked at Whitaker, there was no anger in her expression, no triumph, just a calm clarity that seemed to ask a question without words, a question about what came next and who he chose to be in the answer. The street held its breath once more, not in fear, not in anticipation of conflict, but in a quieter, deeper way, as if waiting to see whether the moment would resolve with the same silence it had begun in, or with something that carried forward beyond it. The air seemed to settle into a deeper quiet after Marcus Ellington's words, not the kind that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that follows when something true has been placed into the open and no one can quite ignore it anymore. And Naomi Carter felt it move through her like a slow exhale, not relief yet, but something steadier, something that allowed her to stand without the same invisible pressure that had held her shoulders tight just minutes before. She shifted her weight slightly, the damp fabric of her shirt now cooler against her skin as the breeze passed again, and she noticed the small details returning to her awareness, the faint hum of a car idling at the corner, the soft clink of a cup being set down inside the cafe, the quiet shuffle of someone adjusting their stance behind her, sounds that had been swallowed earlier but were now finding their way back into the edges of the moment. Officer Ryan Whitaker lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, not fully, but in a way that suggested he was reconsidering the path he had taken to arrive here, his eyes tracing the darkened patch of pavement once more before lifting toward Naomi. And this time, when he looked at her, there was a pause that had not existed before, a hesitation that suggested he was seeing more than just a situation to manage. "Ma'am," he said, the word coming slower now, less automatic, and he stopped there for a fraction of a second, as if deciding what should follow. "You are free to remain." On the sidewalk, he continued, the sentence simple, but carrying a weight that shifted the entire tone of the space. Not an apology, not yet, but a step away from where he had been. Naomi did not respond immediately, her eyes holding his for a moment, not searching, not challenging, just acknowledging the shift, and then she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if accepting the change without needing to name it. Marcus watched quietly, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and, though he did not interrupt, the calm authority he carried remained in the space like a silent boundary, ensuring that the moment did not slip back into what it had been. A faint murmur moved through the crowd again, softer this time, more like a release than a reaction, and one of the phones lowered completely, the person holding it exhaling as if they had been holding their breath longer than they realized. Naomi glanced once more toward the boy near the curb, and this time, when their eyes met, she offered a small smile, gentle and reassuring, and the boy shifted his weight, his grip on the paper bag loosening just a little as he leaned closer to his mother, who now watched Naomi with a different expression, something quieter, more thoughtful. Whitaker adjusted his stance again, his shoulders no longer rigid, and he cleared his throat softly, the sound less sharp than before, more human, and he glanced briefly toward Marcus, then back to Naomi, as if aware now that the moment required more than just a procedural resolution. "I should have handled that differently," he said finally, the words measured, not loud, but clear, enough to carry. And though they were not dramatic, not filled with emotion. They landed with a sincerity that shifted the air once more. Naomi blinked, the statement reaching her in a way she had not expected, and she let it sit there for a second, feeling its weight without rushing to respond. And then she spoke, her voice steady. "Thank you for saying that," she said, the words simple, but grounded in something real, something that did not erase what had happened but acknowledged the step being taken now. Marcus inclined his head slightly, a small gesture that seemed to recognize the exchange without inserting himself into it, and he took a half step back, not leaving, but allowing the space between Naomi and Whitaker to exist on its own terms now. The breeze moved again, carrying with it a subtle warmth as the sun dipped lower, and Naomi felt the last traces of tension leave her shoulders, not all at once, but enough that her stance felt lighter, more her own again. Whitaker nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, and he shifted his weight as if preparing to step away, but he paused, looking at Naomi one more time, his expression no longer guarded, but reflective, as if this moment would stay with him longer than the street around them. Naomi turned slightly, her gaze moving down the sidewalk ahead, the path open, unchanged physically, but different now in the way it felt, and she took a slow step forward, the soft sound of her shoes against the pavement marking the first movement away from the center of the moment. The crowd began to disperse quietly, conversations returning in low tones, the ordinary rhythm of the street easing back into place, but something lingered. Beneath it, something that had shifted in a way that would not fully disappear. Marcus watched Naomi for a brief second as she moved, his expression calm, thoughtful, and though he did not call out to her, there was a quiet acknowledgement in his gaze, as if he had seen exactly what he needed to see. Naomi did not look back, but as she walked, there was a subtle change in her posture, a quiet strength that had always been there now more visible, more grounded, and the late afternoon light caught the edge of her shoulder as she moved forward, no longer defined by the moment behind her, but carrying something from it that could not be taken away. Naomi Carter had taken no more than 3 steps when she heard it, not loud, not sharp, but enough to pause her movement. "Miss Carter," Marcus Ellington's voice called, calm as before, steady without urgency, and she slowed, not stopping immediately, her body continuing forward just half a step more before her feet settled against the pavement again, the sound of her shoes soft but distinct in the late afternoon air. The street behind her had begun to return to its rhythm, conversations picking back up in low tones, the faint clatter of dishes from the cafe blending into the hum of distant traffic, but there was still a thread of attention tied to her, subtle, lingering, as if the moment had not fully released its hold yet. Naomi turned slowly, her movements unhurried, her damp sleeve brushing lightly against her side as she faced Marcus again, her expression composed, not guarded, just present. And for a brief second, the light caught her face in a way that softened the lines of tension that had been there earlier, leaving something quieter in its place. Marcus stood where he had been, his posture unchanged, but his gaze now carried a different focus, not just observant, but intentional, and he took a small step closer, closing the space between them without crossing any boundary, his hands still relaxed at his sides. "Are you all right?" he asked, the question simple, but grounded in a tone that made it more than routine, more than courtesy. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment, considering the answer, not rushing, not dismissing it. "I am," she said finally, her voice steady, and there was truth in it. Even if it was not the whole truth, even if something inside her still felt unsettled, like a glass of water that had been disturbed but was slowly finding its level again. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging her response without pressing further, and his eyes shifted briefly to the fading dampness on her shirt, the way the fabric still clung in uneven patches, then back to her face, as if noting the details, without making them the center of the conversation. Behind them, Officer Ryan Whitaker remained near the curb, his stance no longer rigid, his attention still on the interaction, though he kept his distance now, his hands resting loosely at his sides, the earlier tension replaced by a quieter awareness. Naomi noticed him in her peripheral vision, but she did not turn, did not let her focus drift. Instead, she remained grounded in the moment in front of her, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful, and he spoke again, his voice carrying the same measured calm. Moments like this have a way of staying with people, he said, not as a warning, not as a lecture, but as an observation, and the words settled between them with a quiet weight. Naomi's lips pressed together for a fraction of a second, then softened, and she gave a small nod, understanding what he meant without needing it explained, because she could already feel it. The way this moment had etched itself into her memory. Not just the water, not just the eyes watching, but the shift, the change, the way something had been seen that often went unnoticed. They do, she replied, her voice lower now, more reflective, and she glanced briefly down the sidewalk she had been walking, the path still open, still ordinary, yet carrying a different meaning than it had before. A breeze moved through again, lifting the edge of her hair, and she reached up instinctively to tuck a strand behind her ear, her fingers brushing against skin that was no longer cold from the water, but still aware of it, still remembering. Marcus followed her glance for a moment, then returned his attention to her, and there was a pause, not empty, but full of something unspoken, something that did not need to be rushed into words. You handled yourself with a great deal of composure, he said after a moment. The statement quiet, sincere, and Naomi felt it land differently than the earlier apology, not because it erased what had happened, but because it recognized something she had chosen in the middle of it. She let out a small breath, almost a soft laugh, but not quite. More like a release of something she had been holding, and she nodded again. Sometimes that is all you can do, she said, and there was no bitterness in her tone, just a calm acceptance of something she had learned long before this afternoon. Behind them, Whitaker shifted his weight once more, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting again, as if the words being exchanged were reaching him even from a distance, settling somewhere deeper than the surface of the moment. Naomi turned her attention back to Marcus fully, her posture open, her expression steady, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the silence between them now different from the silence at the beginning, no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but grounded, almost gentle. "Thank you," she said finally, the words simple, but carrying more than just gratitude for his presence, more than just acknowledgement of what he had done. And Marcus inclined his head slightly in response, accepting it without expanding on it, without making it larger than it needed to be. The light had softened further now, the sun dipping lower, casting a warm glow across the street, and Naomi felt the moment beginning to close, not abruptly, not with finality, but with a quiet understanding that it had reached what it needed to reach. She turned again toward the sidewalk ahead, her body aligning with the direction she had been moving before, and this time, when she took a step forward, there was no hesitation, no pause, just a steady movement into what came next, carrying with her not just the memory of what had happened, but the subtle shift that had followed, something that could not be seen, but would not be forgotten. Naomi Carter did not look back again, her steps settling into a steady rhythm against the pavement, each one quiet but deliberate, the kind of movement that did not rush away from something, but moved forward with it still present, still carried, and the late afternoon light followed her along the sidewalk, catching the edges of passing windows and reflecting softly against the glass as she walked. The air felt different now, lighter in a way that was difficult to explain, not because what had happened had disappeared, but because it no longer pressed against her in the same way, and she could feel her breathing return fully to her, deep and even, the kind that filled her lungs without resistance. Behind her, the street resumed its usual pace, conversations growing a little louder, footsteps crossing paths without hesitation. The faint sound of laughter rising from the cafe, as someone inside said something that broke the tension that had lingered there moments before, and though the scene was returning to normal, there was a subtle awareness threaded through it, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, even if no one named it out loud. Officer Ryan Whitaker remained near the curb for a moment longer, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders slightly lowered as he watched Naomi move farther down the sidewalk, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not appear focused on control or procedure, but on reflection, his gaze following her not with authority, but with thought, as if replaying each step that had led to where he now stood. He glanced down briefly at his hands, then back toward Marcus Ellington, who still stood nearby, calm and composed, his presence unchanged, though. The moment around him had begun to disperse. Marcus did not speak, did not call attention back to himself. He simply observed, his eyes moving once toward Whitaker, holding there for a fraction of a second, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as a quiet reminder of what had just taken place and what it meant. Whitaker met that gaze, and something in his expression shifted again, a subtle tightening at the corners of his eyes, not defensive, but thoughtful, as if the weight of the moment had settled more deeply now that the tension had eased. He nodded once, almost to himself, and then turned slightly, his body angling away from the center of the street, the movement small but significant, signaling a step away from the role he had occupied earlier. Naomi continued forward, passing a row of storefronts where the reflections in the windows caught her image briefly before letting it go, her figure moving steadily through the light and shadow. And as she reached the next corner, she slowed just enough to glance across the street, the crosswalk signal counting down in soft, digital numbers, each second ticking quietly in the background of her thoughts. She waited, her posture relaxed, one hand brushing lightly against the side of her shirt as the last traces of dampness faded, and she noticed the small details again, the scent of warm pavement rising in the sun, the distant sound of a bus approaching, the murmur of voices blending into a familiar rhythm that felt grounding, steady. A man standing a few feet away shifted his weight and looked at her briefly, then offered a small, respectful nod before turning his attention back to the street. And Naomi returned the gesture with a slight tilt of her head, the exchange simple but meaningful in its own quiet way. Behind her, the earlier scene had almost fully dissolved, the crowd dispersing into separate paths, the phones lowered, the tension replaced by the ordinary flow of the city. And yet, for those who had witnessed it, something remained, a subtle imprint that would not fade as quickly as the water on the pavement had. Marcus turned slowly, his gaze following Naomi for a brief moment as she stood at the corner, the sunlight catching the outline of her figure. And there was a quiet recognition in his expression, not of what had been done, but of what had been held, what had been chosen in the middle of it. He did not move to follow, did not call out again. He simply stood there, allowing the moment to close on its own terms. His presence no longer needed to shape it further. Whitaker took a step back from the curb, then another, his movements measured, as if each one carried a new awareness. And he glanced once more toward where Naomi had been, now just a figure at the edge of the intersection, and there was something in his gaze that had not been there before, something quieter, more reflective, like a question that had not yet found its answer. The crosswalk signal changed, the soft click of the light shifting, and Naomi stepped forward, her pace steady as she crossed the street, the late sun casting a long shadow behind her that stretched across the painted lines and onto the opposite sidewalk. And as she reached the other side, she did not pause, did not look back. She simply continued, moving into the rhythm of the city with a quiet strength that did not announce itself, but remained unmistakably present, carrying forward the part of the moment that could not be seen, but would not be forgotten. Naomi Carter stepped off the curb and onto the opposite sidewalk, the sound of her shoes changing slightly as rubber met smoother concrete. And for a moment she slowed, not because she needed to, but because something inside her was still catching up with the distance her body had already created from what had just happened. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm, a bus releasing a soft hiss as it stopped a block away, a pair of cyclists passing with a brief rush of wind, the low murmur of voices blending into a steady hum that felt both distant and familiar. And she let it all settle into her senses again, grounding her in something ordinary, something real. She reached up and brushed her fingers lightly along the sleeve of her shirt, now only faintly damp, the fabric cooling against her skin, and she exhaled slowly, her breath visible only in the subtle rise of her shoulders, steady, controlled, like she was placing each piece of herself back where it belonged. A storefront window to her right caught her reflection as she passed, and she glanced at it briefly, not out of vanity, not out of concern, but curiosity, as if seeing herself from the outside might confirm what she already felt inside. And the image that looked back at her was composed, centered, not untouched, but intact in a way that mattered more. Across the street, the place where Everything had unfolded was already dissolving into the background, the dark patch on the pavement fading as it dried. The people who had gathered now scattered into separate paths, their attention pulled back into their own lives. And yet Naomi knew that something from that moment would travel with them, carried quietly in memory, in conversation, in the way they might look at the next situation that did not feel quite right. She turned her gaze forward again, continuing down the block, her pace steady. And as she walked, she noticed the small details that had been invisible earlier, the pattern of cracks in the sidewalk, the faint scent of baked bread drifting from a nearby shop, the soft jingle of a door opening behind her, and each detail felt like a return, a reclaiming of space that had briefly been taken from her. Back at the corner, Officer Ryan Whitaker remained where he had stepped away, though his body had shifted, no longer positioned to command but to consider, and he looked down the street where Naomi had gone, his eyes following the path she had taken until she was just another figure among many. And something in his expression settled into a quiet reflection that did not resolve quickly, that did not offer him an easy conclusion. Marcus Ellington stood a few feet away, his presence still calm, still grounded, and he watched Whitaker for a moment, not with judgment, not with approval, but with a kind of patience that suggested the moment was not finished. Just because the street had moved on, Whitaker let out a breath, longer this time, and he ran a hand briefly along the back of his neck, a gesture that carried a trace of discomfort, of thought, and he glanced toward Marcus again, as if searching for something more to be said, something to anchor what had just shifted inside him. Marcus met his gaze, steady, and after a brief pause, he spoke, his voice low, measured. "What you choose next matters more than what just happened," he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that settled deeply, and Whitaker did not respond immediately, his eyes lowering for a second before lifting again, the statement landing in a place that did not offer quick answers. Naomi continued down the sidewalk, unaware of the exact words being spoken behind her, but aware of the change that had already taken place, the subtle shift in how she had been seen, and more importantly, how she had chosen to remain within it. And as she approached the next intersection, she slowed again, not out of hesitation, but intention, her body aligning naturally with the rhythm of the crossing signal, the steady countdown marking time in quiet increments. A woman, standing nearby, glanced at Naomi, then gave a small, respectful nod, her expression soft, and Naomi returned it with a faint smile. The exchange brief but meaningful, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need explanation. The light changed, and Naomi stepped forward once more, her stride even, her posture relaxed, and the late sun cast a warm glow along the street, catching the edges of buildings, reflecting off passing windows, and wrapping the moment in a softness that contrasted with the tension that had been there not long before. Behind her, the corner returned fully to its ordinary state. But for those who had been there, something remained, not loud, not visible, but present in a way that would shape how they remembered, how they understood. And Naomi, moving forward without looking back, carried that same quiet presence with her, not as a burden, but as a truth that no longer needed to be proven, only lived. The corner behind her no longer held Naomi Carter, but it still held the echo of what had happened, quiet and invisible, settling into the memory of the street like warmth left behind after sunlight shifts, and Officer Ryan Whitaker remained standing there longer than necessary, his gaze no longer tracking movement but resting on the empty space where she had been, as if trying to understand something that had not been part of his training, something that did not fit into the structure he had relied on for years. He drew in a slow breath, deeper than the ones before, and exhaled through slightly parted lips, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the shift from reaction to reflection. And he adjusted the collar of his uniform, not out of habit this time, but as if grounding himself in something familiar while everything else felt subtly altered. The street noise had returned fully now, cars passing through the intersection, footsteps crossing in different directions, the distant rumble of a bus moving away, and yet Whitaker stood still, his posture no longer defined by command, but by thought, his eyes lowering briefly to the pavement where the last traces of water had disappeared completely, leaving no visible sign of what had taken place, only the memory of it. Marcus Ellington remained a few feet away, his presence unchanged, his stance relaxed but attentive, and he watched Whitaker not with pressure, but with patience, allowing the silence between them to stretch without interruption, as if giving space for something to form rather than forcing it into words. Whitaker finally spoke, his voice quieter now, less certain. "I have been doing this job for over 12 years, he said, not looking directly at Marcus at first, his gaze still fixed on the ground. "And I have always believed I was doing it right." The statement coming slowly, each word carrying the weight of something being reconsidered in real time. Marcus did not respond immediately, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged, and when he did speak, his voice carried the same calm clarity that had shaped the moment earlier. "Belief is not the same as awareness," he said, the words simple, not harsh, but direct enough to settle into the space with quiet force. Whitaker lifted his gaze then, meeting Marcus's eyes, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not defensiveness, not authority, but something closer to openness, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it was new. He nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something he had not fully understood until now, and he shifted his weight, his stance no longer rigid, his shoulders lowering in a way that suggested he was no longer holding himself in the same posture he had started with. Across the street, Naomi continued walking, her figure moving steadily along the block, her pace unhurried, her posture grounded, and though she was no longer part of the scene behind her, the impact of her presence remained, carried in the quiet changes unfolding where she had been. Whitaker followed her movement again briefly, his eyes tracking her until she turned a corner and disappeared from view, and for a moment, he remained focused on that empty space, as if the absence itself held something he needed to understand. Marcus took a small step back, not leaving, but shifting the dynamic slightly, allowing Whitaker to stand without the same immediate presence beside him, and he glanced once down the street, then back at Whitaker, his expression thoughtful. "You had a choice," Marcus said after a pause, his tone even, not accusatory, but reflective, "and you will have that choice again." The words settling into the air with a quiet finality that did not demand a response, but invited one internally. Whitaker exhaled again, his breath slower now, more measured, and he nodded, this time more firmly, as if accepting the weight of that truth, and he looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers slightly before letting them rest again at his sides, a small gesture that carried the sense of someone recalibrating, adjusting to a new awareness that had not been there before. The sunlight had dipped lower now, casting longer shadows across the street, the golden light softening the edges of everything it touched, and the corner where the moment had unfolded looked no different than it had an hour before. Yet for Whitaker, it did not feel the same. Marcus turned slightly, preparing to leave, his role in the moment complete, his presence no longer needed to guide it further, and he gave Whitaker a final glance, not lingering, not pressing, just acknowledging the shift that had taken place. Whitaker returned the look, a brief nod passing between them, and then Marcus stepped away, his footsteps quiet as he moved down the sidewalk, blending back into the rhythm of the city as if he had always been part of it. Whitaker remained for a moment longer, then turned as well, his movements slower, more deliberate, and as he walked back toward his patrol car, there was a subtle change in the way he carried himself, not as someone who had lost authority, but as someone who had gained something else, something quieter, something that would not show in reports or procedures, but would shape the way he saw the next moment that required a choice. And as the city continued around him, unchanged on the surface, that shift moved with him, unseen but present, like a line drawn not on the pavement, but somewhere deeper, where it could not simply fade away. Naomi Carter did not notice the exact moment the tension behind her fully dissolved, but she felt its absence in the way her shoulders no longer carried that subtle weight, in the way her steps became more fluid as she moved deeper into the rhythm of the city, and as she turned onto a quieter street lined with small trees and low storefronts. The air seemed calmer, softer, the sounds less crowded, giving her space to think without the pressure of eyes or expectation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns across the sidewalk, and she slowed slightly, her gaze lifting to take in the light as it moved, the simple motion grounding her in something steady, something that had nothing to do with what had just happened, and yet felt connected to it in a quiet way. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small folded cloth, pressing it gently against the edge of her sleeve, absorbing the last trace of dampness, the fabric cool against her fingers. And she exhaled again, a breath that felt fuller now, more complete. A man stepped out of a nearby shop holding a paper cup, pausing for a moment as he noticed her, his eyes flicking briefly to the faint marks of water on her shirt, then back to her face. And instead of looking away quickly, he offered a small, respectful smile, the kind that did not intrude but acknowledged, and Naomi returned it with a slight nod. The exchange quiet, but meaningful in its simplicity. She continued walking, her pace steady, and as she moved past a row of windows, her reflection appeared again, clearer now in the softer light. And she saw not just the surface, not just the image, but the way she carried herself, upright, composed, her gaze forward. And there was a moment, brief but real, where she allowed herself to recognize that, to see the strength in it without needing anyone else to name it. Back at the corner, Officer Ryan Whitaker had reached his patrol car, his hand resting on the door handle for a moment longer than necessary before he opened it. And he paused, looking at the reflection of the street in the window, his own figure mirrored back at him. The uniform still crisp, the badge still in place. And yet something in the reflection felt different, something quieter, less certain, and he let out a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he stood there, not yet getting in. The radio inside the car crackled softly with distant voices, routine calls, familiar patterns, and for the first time in a long while, he did not move immediately to respond. Instead, he listened, not to the words, but to the space between them, the rhythm of something he had always known but was now hearing differently. He thought of Naomi's voice, calm, steady, the way she had not raised it, had not resisted in the way he expected, and the memory did not sit comfortably, not because it accused him, but because it revealed something he had not seen before, something he could not unsee now. He closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again, his hand tightening slightly on the door before releasing. And he stepped back from the car instead of getting in, the decision small but deliberate, and he turned, looking once more down the street where she had gone, though she was no longer visible. Marcus Ellington had already disappeared into the flow of the city, his presence absorbed back into the ordinary, leaving no trace except the shift he had helped bring into the open. And Whitaker stood there alone now, not in authority, not in control, but in a moment of choice that felt different from the ones he had made before. Naomi, a few blocks away, slowed near a small park, the open space drawing her in with its quiet contrast to the street, and she stepped onto the path that curved through it, the sound of gravel underfoot soft, the air cooler beneath the trees, and she let herself pause there, just for a moment, her gaze moving across the open green, the benches, the distant figures sitting or walking, each absorbed in their own space. She placed her bag down beside her on a bench and sat, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture relaxed, and she allowed herself to feel the moment fully now, not just the calm that had followed, but the weight of what had come before, the way it had pressed in, the way she had held herself within it. And there was a quiet recognition in that reflection, not of what had been done to her, but of what she had chosen not to become in response. A child ran past on the path, laughter trailing behind him, light and unburdened, and Naomi watched for a second, a small smile forming without effort, the sound of it reaching something inside her that felt steady, intact. She leaned back slightly against the bench, her gaze lifting to the sky through the branches above, the light filtering down in soft patterns, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to settle, to anchor herself in the quiet that had returned. And when she opened them again, there was a clarity there, not loud, not dramatic, but present, the kind that did not need to be proven, only carried forward, step by step, into whatever came next. The park held a kind of quiet that did not ask anything from Naomi Carter, and she let herself sit in it a little longer, her hands resting loosely in her lap as the sounds around her settled into a soft rhythm, the distant hum of traffic blending with the rustle of leaves and the occasional laughter of children crossing the path. And for the first time since the afternoon had begun, there was no need to respond, no need to explain, no need to hold anything in place. She leaned forward slightly, reaching into her bag again, this time pulling out a small bottle of water, the plastic cool against her fingers, and she took a slow sip, letting it settle, grounding herself in something simple and real, something that belonged entirely to her. A breeze moved through the trees, shifting the light again, and she watched the shadows stretch and fold across the grass, the movement calm, unhurried, like time itself had softened its pace for a moment. Across the park, a man sat reading on a bench, turning a page with a quiet flick of his wrist, unaware of anything beyond his own space. And Naomi noticed the ease of it, the way people could exist in their own moments without interruption, and she allowed herself to feel that same possibility returning to her. She glanced down at her sleeve again, now fully dry, the faint outline of where the water had been barely visible, and she ran her fingers lightly over the fabric, not to check, but to acknowledge, as if confirming that what had happened was now something behind her, something that no longer defined the present. She leaned back again, her shoulders resting against the bench, and closed her eyes for a brief second, the sunlight warming her face, the air steady, and when she opened them, there was a clarity there that felt settled, not forced, not constructed, just present. Back on the street, Officer Ryan Whitaker had finally opened the door to his patrol car, but instead of stepping in, he rested one hand on the frame, his body angled slightly away, his gaze unfocused for a moment as he stood in the space between what had been routine and what now felt uncertain. The radio continued to crackle softly, a voice calling out an address a few blocks away. Something small, something ordinary, and he listened, not moving, his mind still circling back to the earlier moment, not replaying it with defense, but with a kind of quiet scrutiny that did not offer easy answers. He thought of the way Naomi had stood there, not reacting the way he expected, not escalating, not shrinking, just present, and the memory stayed with him in a way that felt different from anything else he had encountered, not because it was dramatic, but because it was steady. He shifted his weight, his hand tightening slightly on the edge of the door, and then he let go, stepping back again, choosing once more not to sit, not to move forward into the next call just yet, but to remain in that space of reflection a little longer. Marcus Ellington, now a few blocks away, walked at an even pace, his hands at his sides, his expression calm, and though the moment had passed, he carried it with him in a way that did not weigh him down, but informed him, a quiet awareness that would settle into the decisions he would make later, in places far removed from the street where it had begun. Naomi shifted her position slightly on the bench, turning her body just enough to face the path again, and she watched as a young couple walked past, their conversation low, their steps in sync, and she felt a small, quiet sense of belonging return, not because anything had been given back to her, but because she had never fully lost it. She stood slowly, picking up her bag, her movements unhurried, and as she stepped back onto the path, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes, she felt grounded in a way that was deeper than before, not untouched, but strengthened by what she had moved through. The light had softened further now, the sun nearing the horizon, casting a warm glow across the park, and Naomi walked forward, her pace steady, her posture relaxed, and though no one around her knew what had happened earlier, there was something in the way she carried herself that did not need to be explained, something quiet, something firm. Back at the corner, Whitaker finally stepped into his patrol car, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound, and he sat there for a moment without starting the engine, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes forward, but his thoughts still anchored to the afternoon, to the moment that had shifted something he could not yet fully name. He let out a slow breath, then another, and when he finally reached to turn the key, the motion felt deliberate, as if he understood now that what came next would not be separate from what had already happened. Naomi exited the park on the far side, stepping back onto the sidewalk, the city opening in front of her again, familiar and unchanged, and yet not quite the same. And as she moved forward, there was no need to look back, no need to measure what had been left behind, because what mattered now was already with her, carried quietly in the way she walked, in the way she saw, in the way she chose to continue. The evening settled gently over the city as Naomi Carter stepped back into the flow of the sidewalk, the sky shifting into soft shades of amber and blue, the kind of light that made everything feel quieter without dimming it completely. and she moved forward with a steady rhythm, her footsteps blending into the low hum of the street as if she had always belonged there, as if nothing had interrupted that sense of place at all. The air carried a slight coolness now, brushing against her skin, and she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, a small, ordinary motion that grounded her in the present, in the simple reality of moving through her own life on her own terms. A passing car slowed at the curb, its headlights flickering on as dusk deepened, and the reflection caught briefly in the glass of a storefront beside her, merging with her own image for a second before separating again, and Naomi noticed it, not with distraction, but with quiet awareness, the way moments overlapped, and then moved on, leaving only a trace behind. She continued walking, her pace unhurried, and as she reached the next block, the familiar outline of her neighborhood began to take shape. The small grocery store on the corner, the faint scent of food drifting from a nearby restaurant, the soft glow of porch lights beginning to appear one by one, each detail anchoring her more firmly in a place that felt like hers. She paused briefly at a crosswalk, the signal counting down in steady numbers, and she stood there with her hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture relaxed, her breathing even, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in that space without any weight attached to it. No eyes on her, no expectations pressing in, just the quiet presence of being. Across town, Officer Ryan Whitaker guided his patrol car slowly through traffic, the interior lit by the soft glow of the dashboard, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his gaze forward, but his thoughts still moving through the layers of the afternoon, not in sharp flashes, but in steady reflection, each moment replaying not as a defense, but as something to understand, something to carry differently next time. He stopped at a red light, the engine idling beneath him, and he glanced briefly at the rearview mirror, his own eyes meeting his reflection, and there was a pause there, a stillness that held longer than usual, as if he was seeing himself not just as he had been, but as he might become. He looked away, back to the road, and the light turned green, the quiet shift forward marking not just the movement of the car, but something subtler within him, a choice forming not in words, but in awareness. Marcus Ellington sat at a desk in a quiet office, the city lights visible through the window behind him, casting a soft glow across the room, and he reviewed a document with steady focus, his pen resting lightly between his fingers, and though the events of the day had passed, they were not gone. They remained present in the way he read, in the way he thought, a quiet reminder of the lives that moved beyond the pages in front of him, the moments that shaped more than what could be written. He set the pen down for a moment, his gaze lifting briefly toward the window, the reflection of the city stretching out before him, and there was a stillness there, not empty, but full of something understood, something that did not need to be spoken to carry meaning. Naomi stepped off the curb as the signal changed, crossing the street with the same steady pace, the evening light casting a long shadow behind her that moved with her, not ahead, not pulling, but following, a quiet reflection of where she had been and where she was going. She reached the opposite side and continued down the block, the rhythm of her steps unbroken, her posture relaxed, her gaze forward, and as she passed a row of houses, a window opened somewhere above, the sound of music drifting down, softly, blending into the night air, and she smiled. Just slightly, not because of anything specific, but because something inside her had settled into place. She did not carry the moment as a burden. She carried it as a truth, something that did not define her, but revealed her, something that did not need to be proven again because it had already been lived. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pools of light along the sidewalk, and Naomi walked through them without hesitation, moving from one to the next, her figure illuminated briefly, then softened again, the rhythm repeating as she continued forward. Somewhere behind her, the city moved on, as it always did, but within it, small changes had taken root, unseen but real, in the way a man would pause before acting, in the way a witness might choose to speak, in the way a moment might unfold differently because of what had been learned. Naomi reached her door, the familiar steps